California's San Andreas Fault creeping section could unleash large earthquakes. The central section of the San Andreas Fault could host larger quakes than previously realized, according to what geologists are saying. The middle section of San Andreas Fault may have the capacity to host larger earthquakes than previously believed. Between the towns of Parkfield and Hollister, the famous California fault undergoes something called a seismic creep. Instead of building up strain and then slipping on one earth-rattled moment, the two sections of fault move imperceptibly, releasing stress without causing large quakes. But looking back millions of years in time, researchers have found that this section of fault may have experienced earthquakes of magnitude 7 and higher. That is larger than magnitude 6.9 Loma Prieta trembler and in the Bay Area of 1989. It's not fully clear how long ago the large quakes on the fault occurred, but they were within the last 3 million years. This is what Genevieve Coffey said, an earthquake geologist at GNS Science in New Zealand. She says the central section should be considered as a potential source of earthquake hazard. The San Andreas Fault has 3 sections. The southern section runs from Salton Sea to Parkland, California, and has a capacity for large quakes. In 1857, for example, a magnitude 7.9 Fort Tejon quake shifted the ground at the fault a whopping 29.5 feet, 9 meters. Can you imagine? The northern section of the fault runs from the town of Hollister through the Bay Area of San Francisco up to Cape Mendocino, California. This section of the fault is most famous for the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which had an estimated magnitude of 7.9. In between Parkfield and Hollister, though, the fault has not given rise to any recorded earthquakes larger than the magnitude 6. Geoscientists have dug into the fault, looking for signs in the shape of the sediment layers of long-ago earthquakes, and they have not found any large quakes in the last 2,000 years. But even if the central San Andreas does not build up enough stress to start a large earthquake, it could act as a conduit for quakes originating on the northern or southern section of the fault, Coffey said. She and her colleagues wanted to go back more than 2,000 years. So to do so, the researchers took advantage of the fact that when a fault slips, it generates friction, of course, which generates heat. Coffey said it's like rubbing your hands together. This heat can spike the temperature of the rocks in the fault by more than 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 1,000 degrees Celsius, and those temperatures changes can change the structure of organic molecules that accumulate between the sediments. Historic earthquakes. The researchers analyzed the sediment core from central San Andreas that was drilled as part of the San Andreas Fault Observatory at Depth SAFOD project, SAFOD project, deep in the core, about 1.9 miles down. That's over 3,000 meters at 3 kilometers down. The researchers found a spot where the biomarkers showed signs of heating. Coffey said that patch of the fault also consisted of these really high deformed siltstones, mudstones. It had lots of these small slip layers, so lots of scaly surfaces and shiny surfaces, which is what we would think of as rocks that had hosted lots of earthquakes. This zone of the fault may have hosted more than 100 quakes, Coffey said. Next, the researchers analyzed the quake-deformed section of rock with a method called potassium-argon dating, and this method takes advantage of the fact that a naturally radioactive variation of potassium-40, slowly decays into argon gas. When something happens to heat the rock, this gas is released, resetting the potassium-argon clock to 0. And by looking at the accumulation of argon, the researchers could determine how long it had been since the rocks were heated. Isn't that something? Their results suggest that the heating happened at the earliest 3 million years ago, but the quakes could have been far more recent, Coffey said. Part of the ongoing work done by Coffey's collaborators involved improving the potassium-argon method for earthquake dating to narrow down that time span. However, the magnitude of the heating indicates that the central San Andreas can indeed undergo a lot of shaking, it's likely that the earthquakes recorded in this section of the fault range from magnitude in the mid-6s to low 7s, Coffey said. She said the work that we did was the first direct geologic evidence of earthquakes in this region of San Andreas. The quakes probably started on the southern portion of the fault and sped along the fault line like an unzipping zipper. Knowing that the fault has this capacity is important for understanding the earthquake hazard in Central California, she said. The researchers plan to apply potassium argon methods to other faults, including in New Zealand's bedrock, where there is not any organic material for traditional carbon-14 dating, which only works back to about 55,000 years, and where there are no sedimentary layers to show the marks of very old earthquakes. And Coffey said, the potassium argon tool is pretty interesting because it really gives us access to a range of faults that we have not been able to date in the past. This is originally from Live Science, Stephanie Pappas. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.